Good afternoon and a warm welcome to our webinar this afternoon. The theme for this afternoon is media, and we're going to be focusing on the LifeGlobal media products and also product evaluation. I'm Emily Austin, Managing Director of Cooper Surgical Fertility Solutions in the UK and Ireland. Joining us today, we're delighted to have Dr. Steve Levett. Steve has a PhD in molecular immunology from the University of Sheffield and undertook his embryology training in St James Hospital, Leeds, where he became Embryology Lab Director. He's also worked at Care Manchester and McGill University Hospital, Montreal in Canada, and globally as a consultant embryologist before working for Wallace, Ferring, LifeGlobal, and now Cooper Surgical, where he's the Director of Clinical Applications. We're also very pleased to have Stacy Macpherson joining us this afternoon. Stacy joined the field of clinical embryology in 2010, shortly after completing a master's degree in biological sciences at the University of Sheffield. She has worked in both the public and private sector. Stacey completed her ACE certificate and HCPC registration whilst working for the NHS at Cambridge IVF. Following on from this, Stacey joined Care Fertility, where she progressed from clinical embryologist to deputy lab manager. Stacey served as webmaster for the UK Association of Clinical Embryologists for 4 years. She joined Cooper Surgical in June 2021 as clinical application scientist. In her new role, Stacey provides clinical support, training and education for customers in the UK and Ireland. We also have a very special guest this afternoon. Jennifer Oyanadal has joined us. Jennifer is an embryologist at City Fertility and has also worked in different labs in Australia, New Zealand and Chile. So lovely to have you with us this afternoon, Jennifer. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And chairing our webinar this afternoon is a regular guest to our webinars, Dr. Steve Troop. With nearly 35 years experience in the field and a PhD in male infertility, Steve has risen through the ranks to have been the scientific director of Liverpool Women's Hospital Hewitt Fertility Centres and more recently IVI's UK centres. As well as his day-to-day operational, managerial and research responsibilities in both the NHS and private sectors, Steve has often provided advice to regulatory bodies, educators, the commercial sector and colleagues around the world. He is particularly proud to have been both chair and president of the Association of Clinical Embryologists and a founder member of the newly formed Association of Reproductive and Clinical Scientists. Steve now works independently as a consultant reproductive scientist based in the UK. Thank you very much for joining us today, Steve. We've a few international delegates with us today, which is lovely. You're most welcome to join us from wherever you are around the world. However, any references that we make to regulation or questions that we cover about regulation will be based on the UK and Ireland. If you have questions at any point, please enter them into the chat box. We love to get your questions, so please ask away. We will pose these questions to our panel after the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Steve, I'm now going to hand over to you. That's you, Steve Levett.
Yeah, always confusing when we have more than one Steve on the call, but thank you, Emily, and thank you for that introduction. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about one of my favourite subjects, which is culture media, and particularly focusing on LifeGlobal today, who, as you mentioned during your introduction, I worked for a number of years before LifeGlobal and I were acquired by Cooper Surgical. So I'm happy to share some of my insights with people today. When one reaches a certain age as an embryologist, you tend to reflect on what's happened in the past, and with this webinar it's no different. So I'm going to look at a little bit of the history behind culture media development and how we got to where we are today. So the culture media story goes back a very long way, and in terms of looking at the field that we work in, the middle of the 1800s, when Ringer, who I'm sure everybody's heard of in terms of Ringer's solution, but as a scientist produced the first media that was capable of supporting an organ outside of the body. So he demonstrated a media that was able to support a beating frog heart. We then moved on to mouse models, looking at specific components that might help in developing a system that would allow independent embryo development from ideally from fertilization, but in those early stages we're looking at mouse embryos that had already been fertilized. So some famous names in the field, McLaren and Biggers, and McLaren and John Biggers, as early as 1958, started to look at this derivation of Krebs Ringer's bicarbonate solution, which had added glucose and bovine serum albumin. Then John Biggers himself described the culture of single-cell mouse embryos in a chemically defined media for the first time. And then the Brinster papers, there are a number between 63 and 65, started to look at what we need to optimize within culture media to give us good embryo development. And this included pH, osmolality, the substrates that we use in the media, whether or not amino acids were required. And in some of the early media that we used in IVF didn't have amino acids in, and albumin, protein, etc. So these were all experimental systems that in these early days included the use of co-culture. So these generally all had systems that involved fallopian tube cells to help with the development of the embryos in vitro. Then we moved to a pivotal year, 1968. I don't quite remember it, but not so long ago. But Whitten and Biggers and then Whittingham published reports that now allowed mouse embryo development to take place without the need for co-culture of these fallopian tube cells. And this was a big step forward. Indeed, the early stages of human IVF involved co-culture, but nowadays, thankfully, we've taken those cells away and we can use a chemically defined media. So Whitten and Biggers described culture of mouse embryos, the blastocyst stage, without the need for these co-culture cells. And then Whittingham published the first report of mouse IVF in 1968, using again this derivation of the Krebs Ringer's solution and added sodium lactate, sodium pyruvate, glucose, bovine serum albumin, now antibiotics. And you can see the start of what we now recognize in the human IVF field. But when we talk about philosophy, so we're jumping forward a little bit now to the early 2000s, but there was a lot of work done in between. But at the early 2000s was an interesting time because we had this divergence of philosophies around embryo culture for human IVF. And these became known as let the embryo choose or back to nature. So if we take back to nature first, we'd had some fairly simple media in the IVF laboratory for a number of years, which were only really there to support development up until day 2 or day 3 in those early days. Certainly when I joined the embryology field in the 90s and early 2000s, we were mainly doing day 2 and then we moved to day 3 embryo transfer. But this paper, pivotal paper by David Gardner and Michelle Lane in 2002 changed people's attitude to what we needed to do in terms of providing media for embryo development through to the blastocyst stage. And as you can see here, their quote was, in order to optimize mammalian embryo development in culture, sequential media are required, each designed to meet the changing requirements of the developing embryo. And it inherently, intuitively appealed to embryologists and seemed as if it was a sensible way forward, because obviously in the in vivo situation, we're going to move from the fallopian tubes into the uterine cavity. And so all of these things sort of played into the hands of this back to nature view. Interestingly, around the same time, there was another philosophy that was being widely publicized, but not really supported, was that if you design the media correctly, you can use that to minimize inherent effects of stress that inevitably are imposed on pre-implantation embryos when placed in a chemically defined environment. And some of you might know Michael Summers. John Biggers was fortunately somebody I met before, and he's no longer with us. But these two interesting approaches seemed to develop at the same time. One gained traction immediately. One took a long time for people to really get on board with the difference between single step and sequential media. And that's what these two are describing. I put this slide in deliberately because I think it's important to understand that whatever we choose to do in terms of designing culture media for in vitro use, as you can see on the right of this cartoon, we can never truly mimic what happens in vivo. In vivo, it's a very different scenario, a dynamic process of the embryo moving through the fallopian tubes, interacting with the epithelium of the fallopian tubes and ultimately going into the uterine cavity, and really only surrounded by a film of fluid, not in a swimming pool as we do in our culture system now. So whatever we do in terms of designing culture media, we will never get to a natural situation. So if people say sequential media is more natural compared to single step media, as you can see from this this diagram, that's never going to be the case. They're both very artificial ways of looking at the same problem. And as I say, sequential media got a lot of traction in the early 2000s, but as time has gone on, we've seen that completely switch to now single step media. So how do you develop those two different strategies? Well, the first one with sequential media, you have to do physiological measurements. So you're looking at the measurement of various components within the female genital tract, and that's obviously within the fallopian tube and the uterine cavity. And then you take a number of readings, a number of measurements that you make on different material, and you form a consensus and build the media around that. That in itself has some issues. We're not going to go really into that today, but when you measure physiological environments, the pure fact that you remove them from their in vivo environment is going to have some impact. Some of the measurements that they came up with in that early paper were a very wide range. So choosing an average was problematic, but without question, sequential media changed IVF, and we got great results if it was used in an optimal way. The way to develop single step media that came about through John Bigger's work and others was to use this simplex optimization model. This has to be done on the mouse because so many embryos are needed to be able to do this that it would be very unethical to do it in the human setup. And you can test a number of components. That also provides a limitation. We can't test everything that goes into the culture media. And you can see on this slide, there are 10 components listed. Most commercially available culture media today probably has around 80 different ingredients, some of which are in very low amounts and some contribute in different ways. So you can see there are limitations here, but it was the starting point for developing a single step media in a scientific manner to give us a chemically defined media. So this is a nice quote about simplex optimization. It's a very sophisticated mathematical model that you use, and it was applied to mouse embryos, which gave rise to this simplex optimization media. So people may have heard of SOM or KSOM, that's where it comes from. So the simplex optimization was later supplemented with higher potassium, became KSOM, and this approach allows you to identify the composition and concentration that give the maximum response, but in this early days in mouse embryos, excuse me, not necessarily the best results. Those have to be refined over time. Human culture media, as I just mentioned, could not be based on these, had to be based on these results, sorry, because we couldn't do similar experiments on human embryos because of the ethical implications of that, when you need to use and monitor hundreds of embryos to get the data that we needed. Despite the different strategies, whether you use sequential or single step media, they can be used in different ways. Single step media more commonly nowadays is used uninterrupted, but in the early days when LifeGlobal first came onto the market, it was used in the same way. So it was a single step media, but was used from day 0 to day 3, and then the media was changed on day 3, as was the case with sequential media, where you have to obviously change the media on day 3. So you can use it in different ways, and it's obviously key that you get whatever system you use in your lab optimized. And we've got Stacy to talk about how you might do that following on from this presentation. So won't go into too much detail, but just to bear in mind, single step media can be used in different ways, either as a continuous culture system uninterrupted, or as an interrupted system as you would use sequential media. And the early studies were generally done using a change on day 3, and the papers that were published comparing LifeGlobal single step media to the sequential media that was were all done in that way. So generally mimicked what was happening with the use of sequential media. Now, culture media components, these are the core components that are in our culture media. It's not a complete list, as I mentioned. Nowadays, we have more than 80 components, but these are the ones that almost universally go from one media, so regardless of which one you choose to use. So they're going to comprise inorganic salts, sodium, potassium, calcium, etc. They're going to have energy substrates. The embryo will use different ones at different times. It was shown quite clearly that amino acids were helpful, so essential and non-essential amino acids. Chelators are in there, mostly a pH indicator. Not all media has it in, but LifeGlobal does. Antibiotics in LifeGlobal media, it's gentamicin. The early days, we used a combination of streptomycin and penicillin. Because of some concerns over allergies, etc., we tend to have moved away from that, and most media now contains gentamicin. We're going to need a protein source or a macromolecule. People have used dextran and other macromolecules in the past, but it's more common to use human serum albumin now. It'll have vitamins in, and all media contains antioxidants, and LifeGlobal Total LP is no different, and those include the pyruvate, EDTA, L-cysteine, L-arginine, etc. So antioxidants are important. They're already present in the media. Again, over time, they've probably become slightly less important as we've moved to low oxygen culture, but certainly in the early days, we needed to have antioxidants present to control the reactive oxygen species that hopefully are less present now because of a change in our incubator setups. So these are the main components of culture media. Of course, they're tweaked for different concentrations, different ratios between different things to give us the culture media that we have today. So this is the timeline for development of LifeGlobal media. You can see, as we mentioned, this simplex optimization media was around 1991 and earlier from some studies, but applied to the human situation. And then we began adding potassium, so we became KSOM. Amino acids were added and became KSOM-AA, and KSOM-AA is the basis for global single-step media. In the early days from 2002 to 2006, the dipeptide of glutamine that was used was alanine glutamine, and then in 2006 switched to glycyl glutamine. This is important that we don't have glutamine in its native form, because the breakdown of glutamine will lead to ammonia production, whereas if we use a dipeptide, this is very much minimized. And that was one of the major concerns when people were thinking about using single-step media, particularly in a continuous culture system. Would the buildup of ammonia become detrimental to human embryo development? And we now know, both from the presence of this dipeptide and also from the results that have been achieved over the years, that that's not the case, and single-step media can work as effectively as any other media if it's used in an optimal way. So also along those lines, the development of this culture media suite was core to the LifeGlobal philosophy. So in the next slide, we'll see the components of the various media in the LifeGlobal suite. But the idea was that all products that were related to the development of from the gametes through fertilization through to blastocyst development, that all products were as closely matched chemically as possible. And any changes that were introduced were purely for functionality reasons. So where you were using the media outside of the incubator, HEPES was replaced the bicarbonate. And for fertilization media, glucose concentration was increased to support sperm and cumulative cell function compared to the single-step media for culture onwards. This theory was really put forward because it was felt that this would eliminate the stress of changing from one media to another on day 3. We often see if people switch from a sequential media to a single-step media, they see embryo development parameters change slightly in terms of the speed with which they reach various milestones. And some of that has been postulated to be the embryo having to react in a sequential system from a change from one particular media type to another, which vary quite significantly. There's only one media to maintain quality control and prepare in the lab, there is obviously no chance of using the wrong media for the stage of development of the embryo. And it was very easy in those early days when we were mainly doing day 3 transfers. But if we wanted to do day 5, we could move in a structured way from a change of media on day 3 to an uninterrupted culture system, because we had the media in-house. And if we had all of the conditions, again, optimized, it would allow us to do that. So this slide gives an indication. Of course, it doesn't give the concentrations on here, but it's a representation of the different media within the media suite. So the culture media, the global total LP, you can see on the left, we've got collection media for the egg collection, fertilization for where we do IVF. In many countries now, we don't do or don't see IVF anymore. Many go straight to ICSI in all of their cases. And then when we need to do procedures outside of the incubator, of course, we replace the bicarbonate with the HEPI. So in the red, you can see where the changes occur. So where we've got collect outside of the incubator, we have HEPIs, and for ICSI, for biopsy, etc., in the global total LP with HEPIs. And in the global collect and fertilization, the glucose concentration is tweaked. This, as I mentioned, this table doesn't give the concentrations, but it's a representation that across the board, in the other factors, all of these concentrations and the ratios between the different components are all the same. So if you move from one media to another, at least the chemical backbone is either identical or very similar, so that it relieves any potential stress there may be on the embryo itself. Just as an aside, the only difference you can see at the bottom, I should have highlighted it in red, is that global collects needs to be supplemented. It doesn't come as a ready-to-use media. So otherwise, everything in the media suite is the same, and that's how we try as far as possible to maintain any stress that may occur on the embryo over time. Anybody that's seen one of my presentations before will probably laugh seeing this particular slide, but I just want to reiterate before we go into Stacy's presentation that culture media is only one part of the culture system. So it's not a cure-all. By changing from one media to another, you're not necessarily going to solve other problems that may exist within the laboratory. So this was a table put together by Don Rieger, who was the VP of R&D at LifeGlobal, and he said there were 175 factors within the laboratory that could influence the outcome, of which culture media is only one, and possibly the most highly quality controlled material that comes into an embryology lab. So there are many other factors here that need to be optimized if you want to get the best results from any culture media that you might have or want to introduce into your laboratory. As I say, Stacey's going to go into more detail. Stolen this slide from a quality control presentation that we do, really to highlight one key factor with culture media. And if you're thinking of changing or evaluating a media, one of the things to bear in mind is that the bicarbonate concentration between different media vary because they're set by the manufacturer and the formulation that's being put forward. So just having one media switching to another doesn't mean necessarily you can use the same conditions that you use currently, because you need to be aware that this bicarbonate concentration may be different. And if it is different, then you'll need a different level of CO2 to maintain the target pH in your laboratory. So just an introduction really into the talk that Stacey's going to give. So LifeGlobal Media has been around for a long time now, from 2002. Its use has been increasing over that time, not least of which because of the introduction of time-lapse incubation, which made people reevaluate the need for a change of media on day 3. So a lot of people, because of introduction of time-lapse into their lab, switched from a sequential to a single-step media. And now the trend worldwide is for much more single-step media to be used than sequential. It is regional, country-specific, but overall we generally see a significant switch to single-step media. Okay, so just the final slide really is to say, just to reiterate, that the media is only one component of the culture system. We need to get everything optimized as well as we can. And really that is to minimize any insults and stresses to the gametes and embryos to give us the best chance of producing healthy embryos that are going to lead to healthy, normal babies and delivery. Okay, so that's my part done, and I will pass over to Stacy now to talk about how you might evaluate a culture media in your laboratory.
Thanks very much, Steve. Just before I let Stacy loose, thank you very much. I mean, I think it's without a doubt the development of commercially available culture media was a game changer, and you and I can both remember sitting there having to make it ourselves, and it was awful. It was difficult. It was arduous. But I think also, you know, the quality of commercially made culture media is far beyond anything that we ever made in our labs, and that's contributed to the, you know, to the increased success rates that I think clinics have seen over the last couple of decades. I suppose one thing which I would like to mention is that there's always been an air of mystery around commercially produced culture media, and I think you've done well there to demystify some of that. People are always worried about whether you guys are adding things in without telling us and stuff like that. And I'm sure that's not the case. So yeah, so to move on now, then changing culture media, or something as important as culture media, it is one that you're likely to have used for, you know, probably years and years and years. Is a difficult decision to make, and even evaluating it before you make that decision can be, you know, can be challenging. You know, do you need approval? How many patients should you look at? What endpoints should you look at? What will the HFEA be expecting to see? This sort of thing. They're just some of the questions that spring to mind. So I'm delighted now to ask Stacy to offer some words of wisdom around evaluating a new culture media in your lab. Thanks very much, Stacy.
Cheers, Steve. So just going to try and share my screen now. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. Wonderful. This is a presentation on media evaluation. We're specifically going to talk about how Cooper Surgical can support your laboratory if you were to choose to carry out a media evaluation. So at Cooper Surgical, we like to use the KISS approach. This stands for Keep It Super Simple. We need to ask ourselves the following questions. Why do we want to perform an evaluation? How many patients or cycles should we include in our evaluation? Who is it that we want to investigate? How do we want to investigate those patients? And what is it that we actually want to measure? So let's start with the why. What is the purpose of the evaluation? Well, many may choose to do an in-house validation, but some may choose to do an evaluation with the option of presenting the data, perhaps at a scientific meeting or maybe in a publication. If you are choosing to present the data, you may need to consider randomization. And if you're using this in your study, it's possible that you'll need local research ethics committee approval in order to go ahead with that study. So that's a consideration you may need to take. Also, from a Cooper Surgical point of view, if you are going to carry out a study, if you want to present that data, we may need to refer you to our medical affairs team in order to help support you with that study. Next, how many? How many patients or cycles should we include in our study? Well, if you're doing a simple in-house validation, 25 to 30 cycles should be enough. However, if you're choosing to present the data, you may wish to consider 50 cycles or more to support your abstract. Who is it that we want to investigate? Well, here are some simple inclusion and exclusion criteria that you may wish to consider. Generally, when it comes to a media evaluation, we're aiming to use the gold standard patients unless we're targeting a specific subgroup of patients. The criteria that we've included here are only suggestions. These can, of course, be modified and added to in order to suit the evaluation you wish to carry out in your laboratory. Next, how are we going to investigate those patients? Well, there's a number of different ways you can carry out your evaluation. You could consider using sibling oocytes. This is a robust way of carrying out an evaluation, but some clinics may find this logistically difficult. There are practical considerations we would need to take into account. This would fall under randomization, so it may be that we refer you to our medical affairs team in order to carry out an evaluation in this manner. Next, we could consider matched patients. Now, matched patients can be challenging in terms of controlling variability that does exist between patients, but carrying out an evaluation in this way is at least contemporaneous. Those patients are going through your laboratory at the same time period. This would also fall under randomization. So again, it could be that you work with our medical affairs team on an evaluation with matched patients. And finally, there's historical controls. Now, this is potentially the least robust way of carrying out an evaluation, but it's probably the easiest way to carry out an evaluation. And it doesn't include randomization. So we could support you, and by we, I mean myself and the UK team alongside Stephen Levett's team as well. We could support you in an evaluation of this manner. And again, additional or different criteria may be needed for your evaluation as opposed to what we've got listed here. So everything in this decision tree can be modified to suit your evaluation. Next, we need to consider how we're going to investigate these patients. So it's really important that we optimize and standardize our evaluation before it takes place. So we may wish to check the pH of our culture media, particularly the media that we're choosing to evaluate. We need to make sure that's optimal before we use it in our laboratory. We, of course, need to consider temperature control. It's probably something that's already incredibly rigorous in your laboratory. We'd need to think about the culture conditions. Ideally, you'd want them to be the same between the control group and the evaluation group. So we need to consider the incubators, the dishes, and how those dishes are set up, group culture, single culture, etc. And then we need to think about how we as the embryologist could add to the variability. So we need to consider inter-operator variability. Finally, what is it that we're going to measure? Now, there are endpoints that we can measure if we carry out a sibling study. For example, it could be possible to look at your blastocyst formation rate, perhaps your utilization rate. Sibling studies do, however, make pregnancy data difficult to collect. In any evaluation, we may choose to avoid subjective measures such as embryo grades. If you would like to look at embryo development using a developmental checkpoint at a certain time point, it is possibly a better way to do it to standardize. And finally, if we're going to use historical controls, we need to be wary of changes that could have occurred in your laboratory over time. So we really need to think about how the changes in your lab could affect our control group and our evaluation group. Now, what is it that we're going to measure? We do provide data collection templates that may help record the data that you wish to collect. Now, lots of laboratories may not need this, but some clinics do say it's quite hard to retrieve the data from the actual central database within the lab. So if it's easier to collect the data the old-fashioned way, we can provide templates to assist with this. So in summary, you can see the decision tree laid out here in an A4 page. It's a simple tool to help guide you through your study design. It gives guidance on the purpose of the evaluation and whether or not you intend to publish. It can help indicate the number of cycles or patients that may be needed for the evaluation. And if you do wish to power a study, we can offer references that can help you to power the study appropriately. It leads the reader to the appropriate study design, possible inclusion and exclusion criteria, and relevant endpoints to consider for the evaluation. And if needed, we can of course provide sample data collection templates to assist your evaluation. As always, at Cooper Surgical, we offer ongoing support. So if you would like us to, we can help you with the start of the evaluation, during the evaluation, and of course, at the end of the evaluation. Your first point of contact may well be the UK and Ireland team. So you've got your local account managers, you've got myself, I'm obviously the clinical application scientist for the UK and Ireland. And we also work very closely with our professional education and clinical support team. This is a team of very experienced embryologists that can help support evaluations. And I must credit David Morrell because he has designed and implemented the decision tree that I've discussed with you today. Thank you for listening.
Great, thank you very much, Stacey. I think, and you know, any help that Cooper Surgical are able to offer to clinics will be welcome, and certainly the sort of things that you've described will be, I think, would be really useful in evaluating culture media. That's my personal opinion. But the theory is all well and good. And our final speaker today, I'm pleased to invite Jennifer, who I understand has recently had first-hand experience of changing culture media and evaluating culture media just over a year ago, and has very kindly agreed to share her experience today. So, Jennifer.
Yes, hi. Firstly, I wanted to apologise, my camera's not working today. But yes, so I'm part of Gannett City Fertility. We are a LifeGlobal buyer. So our clinic, I believe, is part of the Future Life group, who is also a LifeGlobal buyer. So we approximately purchase around 10 bottles of each type of media per month. We mainly use the 30 mils of LifeGlobal Total LP, and also the 50 ml of Global Fert and the Hebes. So we are a smaller clinic, and we do use the lower volumes of the bottles, and yeah, they work perfectly well for us. We find that they're reliable, there's sufficient quantity in the bottle. The only thing that we find a little bit unfortunate we've had to discontinue to use was the paraffin light oil. We found that there was a significant amount of bubbles in using this oil, and we've had to discontinue the use of that. Apart from that, we do have, we've seen from switching over to this media, we've seen that we have approximately 60% of blasters formation, which is quite good. Also, our FERT rate is approximately at 65%. We do have a suspicion that the global total FERT media may be causing our patients, specifically our IVF patients, their PMs to fade early. However, we're keeping an eye on that. But overall, we are happy with the use of the media that Global have prescribed us.
Great, thanks very much, Jennifer. There is a bit of a. I'm hearing you twice, so I don't know if you have a bit of feedback on your microphone, but
it could be.
it's okay. We could hear you, but it's slightly strange. It may just be me. It probably is. Okay, so we now have probably 15 minutes or so for questions to the panel. If you'd like to ask questions, please stick them in the Q&A box in the usual way. There's a few that have arrived already, and there's some quite interesting ones and some challenging ones, I think. Let's start with an easy one for Stacey. Well, I think it's an easy one. There's a question here about whether you only support culture media evaluation, or whether you can support the evaluation of other products, I guess, catheters and things like that.
Yeah, that's a nice, easy question. Yeah, the answer is yes. The decision tree has been designed across multiple products. So absolutely, yeah, we could support with any evaluation really, but we have decision trees set up for catheters, needles, pipettes, andrology media, pixie dishes, if that's something that you're interested in, whatever it is you want to evaluate, we're here to support you. Absolutely.
And just to follow up on that, what form does the support take? Is it you? Is it you know, is it physical help? How far does it extend?
It really depends what the clinic needs. You know, obviously some clinics may feel they don't need this support, some clinics may appreciate it. So in terms of a media evaluation, we would probably set up a meeting that could be in person or virtual, depending on availability, of course, of the clinic. We could take you through the decision tree. We could obviously discuss where you might want to make changes and how you might want to set up your evaluation. Obviously, that's completely down to you. We're just here to provide a guide. And then in terms of optimization, if you're introducing a media to evaluate, it's probably a good idea to bring us in to do some pH testing. Even if, you know, we're fairly confident you're working at the right CO2 concentration, and you know, you may have clinics that you know that are already working with that media. The best way to be sure that that pH is optimal is to test it. So we're always very happy to come in and do that before a media evaluation takes place. And then, yeah, it's a case of carrying on with it. And if you want that regular support, those check-in meetings, we'd be very happy to arrange those as well.
So it's as much or as little
Absolutely.
as you feel you need. So if you just wanted the decision tree, is that available, and how would somebody get that?
Yeah, so we always like to explain the concept with somebody in the clinic before we send it out. But you could reach out to your local account manager or myself or a member of the professional education and clinical support team, and we'd be happy to take you through it. That's fine.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stacey. Jennifer, here's a question for you. How did the rest of the team respond to a change in culture media? Did you have to cajole them, or were they open-minded? Were there difficulties?
I think at first there was a little bit of apprehensiveness from the team, but then so other clinics in the Future Life group were already using the global brand, specifically in the Czech Republic. So then they were getting very good results, and once we had streamlined that and started to use it ourselves, we were noticing that these changes were for good. So after, I think, an initial 3 months of using the global brand, yeah, everybody was on board and very happy with the results that we were getting compared to the other media that we were using beforehand. So it took a bit of work, but after about 3 months, yeah, everybody agreed.
Okay, great. And was there something specifically that prompted you to change media, or was it just because that's what was happening within the group?
I think it was mainly because the Future Life brand wanted us to change it, and also because we were willing to change in order to get our blastocyst formation up, our FERT rates up, and I think because in the Czech Republic they were having really good rates, we decided to have a go with it as well.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's have a difficult one for Dr. Levett, shall we? Please, can you explain how the shelf life of culture media is determined?
I can certainly try, Steve. So there's actually a huge industry looking at shelf life of all sorts of products, from food that you buy in the supermarket to machinery, etc. But in terms of culture media, or any media that we use in the embryology lab, of course you have to look at the componentry. So what's actually within the media that's likely to affect the shelf life. So some components will have more stability than others. You need to look at the volumes that you're supplying in terms of bottles of media that will be open and closed significantly. If it's a single-use item, that has one issue. If it's kept closed until you actually use it, then you never use it again. So you've got to look at all of those factors as well. You've got to look at the storage conditions, whether you store it at room temperature or at refrigeration temperature, 2 to 8 traditionally. And then you do stability studies. So you look at the product, you store it and use it as laboratories would, and you look over time to see whether it maintains the performance that you set the parameters for. So you pick the various parameters you want to measure and you determine whether over a time period that media itself will maintain those parameters. Obviously, in most cases, things like fertilization rate, blastocyst development rate, those sort of things. And then there's a commercial consideration as well, of course. So you also need to look at how people use the products and determine whether it's something that they would want to use over a 12-month period, or whether they're going to want to change media on a more regular basis. You mentioned when we used to make our own culture media, which looking back really was a horrific experience. And some of the hangover from that still exists today, I think, in terms of people's view of variability or batch to batch variation that you see. I'm confident from what I've seen and what I've experienced that today there's really very little batch to batch variation across the board in culture media. I mean, even when the first commercially available media came about, there were occasions I can remember in the lab thinking, oh, that was a really good batch of that particular media. I wonder if we can get any more. But today, really, there shouldn't be, in most labs, any variation from opening one bottle from one batch to the next. But that does mean that people have to follow the guidelines closely. And I'm sure we've all been in the situation where people say, you know, the use by date is today. Can I use the media tomorrow? Can I use it the day after? All you can say, or all I can say, is that the company, the commercial operation, that doesn't just apply to Cooper Surgical, that applies across the board. They only have validated data up to that point. Now, if you made the dishes the day before and you were doing 5, 6, 7 day culture, then of course the media doesn't have a self-destruct switch. It will continue to work. But beyond that, then if labs use the media after its use by date, they're then taking a risk and the company can't support them should anything untoward happen. So it comes down to componentry, stability studies, how the media is stored, and how it's used. All of those factors come into play to determine what the shelf life should be.
Great, thanks, Steve. So just picking up on something you said there about using culture media after it's expired or after the expiry date, which may be a more accurate way of describing the media. Can I ask Stacy and Jennifer whether they, well, I know you won't now, Stacy, because you work for Cooper Surgical, but when you were an embryologist, would you have used culture media that had expired? And the same question to Jennifer, perhaps.
No, we don't use culture media that has expired. We make sure that a week before the culture media's expiry date, we have enough in the fridge for them just to switch over to the new expiry date. We also have implemented in our lab the RI witness, which then reports us and tells us when media is going to be expired, possibly a week beforehand, but we always make sure that we have new media in our fridge, so we don't use expired culture media. It's not a common practice for us.
Great. Stacey?
Yeah, completely agree with Jennifer. We didn't use expired culture media in our laboratory, and it's having those prompts in place. As Jennifer said, we would use our eyewitness as well to ensure that we are not setting up dishes, so that those dishes, of course, have media in them that's expired during the embryo culture period. It really does take good organisation, I guess, and making sure you're ordering on time in order to make sure that your culture media doesn't expire before you make the dishes, but also during those dishes are in use. So yeah, not something we would ever do. No.
Okay. And I suppose also there's a very obvious medical legal risk if you do have to use, or if you are forced to use expired culture media, you would really have to be able to justify doing that and have good reasons for doing it. Okay, loads of questions here. Let's go back to Steve. Okay, I'm going to read this one out. This is like a PhD question, Steve. Okay. Given the reduction in free radical formation at low oxygen culture conditions, does it make any difference what combination of antioxidants are in the media?
Gosh, that's a good question. Well, of course, the answer is if it mops up all of the free radicals, then no. And mostly the antioxidants that are currently present over the last 20 odd years have shown that the culture has been perfectly fine. So we don't have empirical data because we don't measure reactive oxygen species in the media or spent media. It's very difficult to do. So we have to use the experience of people using the media, and the fact that many of the components of culture media already have antioxidant properties. So adding additional antioxidants, we'd have to see some significant data that showed that that was beneficial in the human IVF world. I mean, there's been some experimentation on mouse models, but as we've seen, we use them in the initial phases because it's hard to do these studies on human embryos, but things have come and gone in the past that have shown differences in a mouse setup that haven't transferred into the human setup. So the opinion is still open. Of course, we're always looking for ways to improve. We still don't know. I don't think anybody could put their hand on their heart and tell you what the ideal culture media is for human embryos. They've evolved over time, but there's no definitive answer, which is why there are many brands selling different types of media. The way we use it, we can use it to minimize the production of harmful material within the culture system over time. But I think the history will show us, again, specifically moving to low oxygen is helpful. But the development of embryos has shown us over time that the antioxidants that are present anyway seem to be effective in allowing us to produce not only viable embryos, but viable, healthy children from that.
Thanks, Steve. So, in essence, antioxidants need to be there, but there's no real evidence that one concoction of them is better than any other. No,
and all culture media that's commercially available has different components, different ratios of different things, but they're all designed to do the same thing, and it's to minimize the impact of any toxic material that's produced during culture, and they seem to be pretty effective at doing that.
Okay. A practical question around pH testing. I mean, you raised that point about how important it is to ensure that the correct pH for that culture media is being used when you're evaluating it. So could I perhaps ask Jennifer, how was that done in reality when you started to look at the LifeGlobal media in terms of pH?
Yeah, we do that once a year, I believe. We arrange, I think it's with Cooper, who come out to do our pH testing. What we do is we aliquot media into some dishes and leave the dish in the incubator overnight. Then one of the technicians will come out the next day and will then use their instruments to have a reading of the pH. So that's how we do it here.
Okay, and Stacey, do you want to add anything to that?
We use a blood gas analyzer. So we've got the equipment that perhaps not all laboratories have, and that, as far as we're aware, is the most accurate way to measure pH in culture media. So obviously, if that is of use, then that service is there for anybody that would like us to look at that. Not all culture media is the same in terms of its bicarbonate levels. So it may be that if you are doing an evaluation, it may be that an adjustment in the CO2 concentration may have to take place for the evaluation media. So it's certainly worth discussing with the supplier of the media. And if the testing is available, there's no harm in having it carried out to make sure that that media, that culture system in terms of pH really is optimized before you put any embryos in it.
Great, thanks, Stacey. So gosh, we're nearly out of time. I'll finish with this this question, which I think is a really important one. So in our new world, CE marking is being replaced, I think in about 12 months' time, with UK CA marking. So the question is whether the LifeGlobal products will be UK CA marked appropriately. That can go to Steve first.
Yeah. Yes, the plan is to do so. Of course, anybody that knows the history of LifeGlobal Media will know that CE marking has been a thorn in the side for some time, particularly because its first iteration included what's called LGPS, or protein supplement, rather than HSA, which had alpha and beta globulins in it. Those particular components cannot be CE marked, so the product had to be withdrawn from the European markets because it couldn't be CE marked, and it was replaced with just products with HSA in itself. So because of that experience, everybody's well aware that we need to comply with all of the regulations. We have people in place. I think the UK team are actually employing somebody on the regulatory side specifically for Cooper Surgical products to make sure that they comply with all these regulations. So anybody that's worked within or knows, worked closely with Cooper Surgical know that the adherence to regulatory standards are extremely important and rigorously enforced. So we wouldn't be able to sell the product if we don't go down this route. So for everybody's benefit, I would just say that CE marking is not a measure of quality, and people need to be aware of that. So even when people look back and think, oh, well, we used to use this product, it wasn't CE marked, had no indication that that wasn't good quality. It just didn't meet those regulatory requirements or have the relative certification. But going forward, it definitely will.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Okay, so I think we'll wrap the questions up there. Thank you very much for your consideration in answering those. And I'll hand back to Emily now.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Steve. Well, a huge thank you to our special guest, Jennifer, for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Oh,
Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Thank you so much for joining. We love it when we have a presenter from a clinic, and we're really appreciative of you giving up our time today. I think it really brings the subject matter alive, I think, for our viewers. So thank you so much. Thank you very much to the two Steves and to Stacy for presenting today. Always a pleasure to hear you speak. And thank you very much to Tenna, our marketing manager, who organised this webinar, and Tenna's been our web host master today, so she's been running everything behind the scenes. So thank you to Tenna. If there are any lab or theatre procedures or aspects of fertility that you would like us to cover in a webinar, please do let us know. You can either contact your account manager or you can email us at customerserviceuk@coopersurgical.com. Our next webinar will be tackling the subject of mosaicism with Dr. Tony Gordon and Dr. David Crimes. And we'll be answering questions such as what are mosaics, how do we accurately assess mosaicism, and how is mosaicism detection important, or why is it important for embryo transfer prioritisation? So this webinar will be held on Tuesday, the 19th of July at 12:30. So please do join us for that. If you'd like more information on this and any of our other webinars and face-to-face events, which we're very pleased to be running again, please do send an email to our customer services team. That's customerserviceuk@coopersurgical.com, and they'll be very happy to sign you up to our fortnightly bulletin. So it just remains for me to say thank you so very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have your company, and thank you very much for your questions, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.